And if Ferrari don't like that, they can as well. In fact, Mercedes, they can all because I want that sport to be exciting again. Something is wrong with Formula One. Well, number one, get rid of the stewards.
What happens when the world's most credible car reviewer stops recognizing the cars he covers? At a recent fan event, Jeremy Clarkson didn't dodge the question. He said modern cars are junk and that he can't identify 80% of what's currently on sale. This is a man who spent 36 years building a career on genuine enthusiasm, not manufactured outrage. His complaints aren't vague nostalgia either. He can point to a BMW heavier than a Chevy Tahoe, a touchscreen he compares to a 1970s stereo, and a subscription that made an industry look greedy. Let's break down exactly what changed and why he might be onto something real. Clarkson's most honest verdict yet. The moment came at a fan event, not a television set. Clarkson, Richard Hammond and James May had just wrapped their final Grand Tour special, and during the audience question session afterward, someone asked the obvious thing. After decades of reviewing cars, did he still love them the way he used to? He did not soften the answer. He told the crowd, bluntly, that modern cars are all rubbish now. His actual word was considerably stronger, and that he could not identify 80 to 90% of the vehicles currently on sale. When a fan mentioned some manufacturer's new hybrid drivetrain, Clarkson's response was that he simply did not care, not performed indifference. Actual indifference, from the man who once made an entire career out of caring more than anyone else in the room. Why would the most enthusiastic voice in automotive journalism suddenly stop being able to name the cars around him? Coverage of the comment spread fast, because it landed differently than his usual provocations. Clarkson has built a persona on saying outrageous things for effect, and even his fans know it. But provocation and genuine confession read differently on camera, and this read as the second one, closer to exhaustion than to a punchline, the sound of someone who has simply stopped looking. As an example of what he still respects, he pointed to the 1970s era classic he had driven in that final special, praising how light and alive it felt compared to anything built today, comparing the drive to something closer to dance than transportation. That contrast is the entire argument in miniature. It was not that Clarkson forgot how to enjoy cars, it was that he found something old that reminded him what enjoying a car used to feel like, and the comparison made everything modern look worse by contrast. Automotive outlets that covered the comment treated it less as a punchline and more as a data point, running follow-up pieces asking whether their own readers agreed, which is not typically how the press responds to a celebrity being deliberately provocative for attention. To understand why this particular verdict carries weight, it helps to understand who is delivering it. Clarkson grew up in Doncaster, in Yorkshire, in an unremarkable household with no connection to the car industry at all. His path into cars was not inherited privilege, it was obsession, built slowly through ordinary provincial life before he ever got behind a wheel professionally. He started as a regional newspaper journalist, writing about cars for local papers long before national television found him, which means his credibility was built on years of unglamorous, unpaid attention to the subject, rather than a sudden discovery. By 2002, when Top Gear relaunched in its modern format, Clarkson had found a show that matched his obsession rather than manufacturing one for the cameras. Alongside Hammond and May, he spent the next 13 years turning car reviews into genuine television events, driving hypercars most viewers would never see in person, and describing them with a kind of unguarded enthusiasm that is difficult to fake convincingly for that long. Clarkson left the BBC in 2015 after a physical altercation with a producer, a move that could have ended his career, but instead relocated the entire show and the entire trio to Amazon under a new name, the Grand Tour. For 8 more years, across 5 seasons, they kept doing largely the same thing that had made them famous. Is that the resume of someone qualified to declare an entire industry has lost its way? Few people alive have spent as many consecutive years professionally evaluating cars across as many manufacturers, categories, and price points as Clarkson has, and that volume is exactly what makes his current verdict land differently than an ordinary complaint from someone new to the subject. It also explains why the reaction split roughly along the same lines that his career always has. Loyal readers of his newspaper column treated the comment as confirmation of something they had suspected from his writing for years, pointing back to a gradual cooling in his reviews that had been visible in hindsight for nearly a decade before the fan event made it explicit. Industry analysts, meanwhile, treated it as a useful, if blunt, data point about enthusiast sentiment more broadly, since Clarkson's audience skews toward exactly the kind of engaged, high-spending car buyer that manufacturers spend enormous marketing budgets trying to reach, and rarely hear from this directly. That combination, a beloved voice, a specific and quotable line, and an audience manufacturers actually care about, is precisely why the comment kept circulating for weeks, rather than fading after the initial news cycle, showing up in car forums, dealership conversations, and eventually in trade press, asking whether the industry's own instincts about what customers wanted had quietly drifted away from what those customers were actually saying out loud. Why Clarkson says, modern cars lost their feel. Start with the simplest, most measurable complaint. Modern cars have become extraordinarily heavy, and Clarkson has pointed to specific examples to prove it is not just a feeling. Take a current generation BMW M5, a car built for performance rather than family hauling. Its hybrid powertrain alone adds nearly 900 pounds compared to a purely combustion setup, and the finished car weighs in at more than 5,300 pounds, heavier than a full-size Chevrolet Tahoe, a vehicle built to carry 8 people and tow a boat. Why does a sports sedan now outweigh a body-on-frame family truck? The answer is not any single villain. Safety regulations demand more structural reinforcement than cars needed a generation ago. Crash test standards require reinforced pillars, additional airbags, and crumple zones engineered with far more precision than before. Hybrid and electric powertrains add battery packs and dual propulsion systems on top of a combustion engine rather than instead of one, at least until a manufacturer commits fully to one direction. Collision detection hardware, cameras, radar sensors, and the computers that process all of it add further mass, all of it necessary for the safety features modern buyers now expect as standard. None of this is disputable on its own. Every individual addition improves safety or reduces emissions. The problem is what all of it does together to how a car actually drives. Weight changes everything about a car's character. How it turns into a corner, how quickly it changes direction, how alive the steering feels in your hands. A car that weighs a small house's worth more than its predecessor cannot help but feel less connected to the road, regardless of how much horsepower gets thrown at the problem to compensate. The irony is that manufacturers know this, which is why so many current models now ship without a spare tire at all, replaced by a thin repair kit, or nothing at the roadside beyond a phone number for roadside assistance. A deliberate weight-saving measure meant to claw back a small fraction of the mass that safety and electrification requirements added everywhere else. It is a strange kind of accounting. Shed 40 or 50 pounds by removing a full-size wheel a driver might genuinely need on a dark motorway, while the battery pack and the extra airbags stay exactly where they are. If weight is the complaint Clarkson can prove with a number, the touchscreen is the complaint he can prove with a feeling, and it might be the one that irritates him most. In a conversation with a fellow car enthusiast on a popular automotive interview show, Clarkson described scrolling through a modern BMW's climate and infotainment menus and compared the experience to operating an old 1970s stereo equalizer, a wall of unlabeled sliders that require you to already know what you are looking for before you can find it. His complaint was specific and practical rather than nostalgic. He said he simply wants a button. Press it, and the thing happens. No menu, no sub-menu, no glancing down at a screen while doing 70 miles an hour to find the setting that used to be a single physical dial within reach of his hand. What makes this a real engineering complaint rather than a generational one is the underlying logic manufacturers have openly admitted to. A single glass panel is measurably cheaper to manufacture and install than dozens of individual physical switches, each with its own wiring, mounting bracket, and quality control process. It also photographs better in a showroom and a brochure. So why did an entire industry converge on the same solution at roughly the same time? Because the accounting made sense before the driving experience did. Clarkson has never objected to technology for its own sake. His objection is narrower and more precise than a general suspicion of screens. It is that a physical switch rewards muscle memory in a way a flat glass surface simply cannot replicate, no matter how well it is designed. And every software update that moves a function to a different screen resets that memory and demands fresh visual attention at the exact moment a driver should have none to spare. Both trends carry a cost that extends well past the test drive. Heavier cars wear brakes, tires, and suspension components faster, expenses that eventually land on the owner rather than the manufacturer. Touchscreen-dependent systems tend to age poorly compared to a physical switch, since a screen can lag, freeze, or require a software update just to keep basic climate controls responsive, turning what used to be a purely mechanical, near-permanent component into something with its own quiet expiration date. When car ownership became a subscription, nothing captured the industry's shift in priorities quite as cleanly as the story of the heated seat subscription. In the middle of 2022, BMW began offering heated seats, a feature already physically installed in the car at the factory, as a monthly add-on subscription, priced at roughly $18 a month in several markets. The hardware sat there the entire time, wired and ready. Customers simply were not allowed to turn it on unless they kept paying. The backlash was immediate and, by industry standards, unusually unified. Owners who had already paid tens of thousands of dollars for the car were furious at being asked to pay again, on a recurring basis, for something bolted into the seat they were already sitting in. Why would a company risk that kind of anger over a feature that costs almost nothing to include for free? Because someone in a finance department had calculated that a small percentage of owners would pay anyway, and that recurring revenue looks better on a quarterly earnings report than a one-time hardware sale does. About a year later, BMW reversed the decision entirely. A company board member explained to industry press that customers felt they were paying twice for the same thing, once through the purchase price, then again through the subscription, and that the perception of unfairness outweighed whatever revenue the program generated. The company has continued experimenting with subscriptions for genuinely software-based features, ones that require ongoing data connections or cloud processing, while stepping back from charging separately for hardware that was already installed and paid for. Clarkson's fury on this subject runs deeper than one bad pricing decision from one manufacturer. It is what the decision reveals about how the entire industry now thinks about its customers. The engine can already produce the extra horsepower. The seats can already reach that exact temperature. The steering can already respond that quickly. Someone simply decided that access to what a customer already paid for should be metered and monetized after the fact. The same way a streaming service gates a bonus episode behind a premium tier. A car, in this model, stops being a product you own outright and becomes a platform you keep renting pieces of, indefinitely, for as long as you keep the keys. Manufacturers rarely frame it that bluntly in their own marketing, preferring language about flexibility and personalization. But the underlying mechanism is the same one streaming services and mobile games have used for years, applied for the first time to an object that costs as much as a house down payment. BMW was not alone in testing this pattern either. Mercedes-Benz ran a version of the same idea from the other direction, offering an acceleration increase subscription on certain electric models that unlocked extra horsepower already sitting dormant in the motor. A yearly fee, priced in the hundreds of dollars, that shaved a fraction of a second off the car's sprint to highway speed without touching a single physical component. The car did not get faster. The software simply stopped holding it back once the payment cleared. Other manufacturers have run similar experiments in different corners of the same idea. Subscription gates on remote start, on premium navigation packages, on extra performance modes the hardware could already deliver, each one quietly testing how far owners will tolerate paying twice for capability the car rolled off the factory floor already possessing. The complication does not end with the original buyer. A used car changes hands with whatever subscription status the previous owner left behind, meaning a second buyer can discover, after the sale, that features visible in the listing photos are locked behind a paywall they now have to open themselves. That shifts an old, simple question, does this car have heated seats, into a newer, stranger one. Does this car have heated seats that are currently switched on? For an industry that spent a century selling ownership as a clean, finished transaction, that is a genuinely new kind of uncertainty to hand a customer. Dealerships have had to build entirely new sales conversations around it, walking buyers through which features are permanently theirs and which ones require an ongoing account, a distinction that did not exist in any meaningful way a decade ago and that many buyers still find genuinely confusing at the point of signing. Why Clarkson still drives the past. To understand what Clarkson is actually mourning, look at what he refuses to give up. Despite driving nearly every current flagship the industry produces as part of his job, Clarkson's own daily vehicles are an 18-year-old Range Rover and a 12-year-old Jaguar, cars old enough to predate most of the touchscreen and subscription trends he now criticizes. That is not an accident. It is a statement, made with his own money rather than a manufacturer's press loan. If modern cars were genuinely better in every measurable way, why would the man with access to literally anything choose to keep driving cars nearly 2 decades old? During the final special of his long-running television partnership, filmed in Zimbabwe alongside Hammond and May, the trio each drove a classic car from the 1970s, rather than anything current. Clarkson's assigned car for that trip was a Lancia Monte Carlo, light enough that he compared the experience of driving it to watching a ballerina move, deliberately, precisely, without a single wasted motion. A ballerina's grace comes specifically from the absence of excess weight and unnecessary movement. Clarkson was describing a car, not a person, but the underlying compliment is identical: lightness as a form of honesty. That his most vivid compliment of the entire trip went to the oldest, simplest car in the lineup, rather than to anything built in the last decade, was not lost on the people covering the special. The contrast did more to make his point than a direct complaint about any specific new model could have, precisely because it was offered as praise rather than criticism. It is worth being clear that Clarkson is not simply a nostalgic contrarian who rejects everything modern on principle. He has continued to praise specific current cars with real, ongoing enthusiasm, Porsche's sports car lineup in particular, along with smaller, more focused manufacturers building cars explicitly for driving rather than commuting. What those survivors share is not a shrinking price tag or a smaller company size, though several of them happen to be smaller, independent manufacturers rather than mass-market giants. It is that the people signing off on the final product still measure success primarily by how the car behaves on a real road, rather than by how it performs in a boardroom presentation about quarterly unit sales. That is a genuinely narrow filter to survive, which is presumably why the list of manufacturers still clearing it stays short, and why Clarkson's praise for the ones that do carries the weight of scarcity rather than routine flattery. If Clarkson is measuring modern cars against something, it helps to know what that something actually was. Roughly between the mid-1990s and the end of the 2000s, automotive engineering reached a kind of sweet spot that enthusiasts and journalists alike still reference as a high point. A window when manufacturing precision had advanced far enough to make cars genuinely excellent, but before the touchscreen, subscription, and shareholder-first mentality had fully taken hold. Cars built in that window shared a common language regardless of manufacturer or price point. Steering that transmitted the texture of the road directly into a driver's hands. Engines that revved freely and made distinct, mechanical noises tied to what was happening inside them. Manual gearboxes that demanded a driver's full participation, and interiors where every switch and dial had been placed exactly where a hand naturally reached for it. Enthusiasts still point to specific cars from that stretch as reference points, precisely because so many of them remain beloved decades later. Lightweight, naturally aspirated sports cars, built by manufacturers who were, at the time, more interested in how a corner felt than in how a spec sheet compared to a rival's marketing department. Can raw technical progress ever fully replace the specific human judgment call that decides where a switch goes and why? That culture did not vanish overnight. It eroded slowly, decision by seemingly reasonable decision, as each individual choice to add a screen, add weight, or add a paywall got signed off in isolation, without anyone stepping back to ask what the sum of all those choices would eventually do to how the finished car felt to drive. Clarkson's final verdict on the car industry. Underneath every individual complaint, the weight, the screens, the subscriptions, sits one larger structural shift, and it is the one Clarkson keeps circling back to across interviews and columns. The balance of power inside car companies has moved from engineers to accountants. For most of the 20th century, a chief engineer at a major manufacturer could genuinely delay a product launch because something about the car was not right yet, and that objection would be respected rather than overridden. That balance has shifted, and the pressures behind the shift are real rather than imagined. Electrification mandates have forced enormous capital investment into entirely new powertrain technology on a compressed timeline. Emissions regulations have demanded engineering solutions that satisfy a regulatory test, rather than necessarily improving how a car feels to drive. Shareholders, quarter after quarter, have rewarded predictable recurring revenue over the kind of decade-long reputation management that used to matter more than the current earnings call. None of these pressures are villains acting in isolation. They are the ordinary incentives of running a public company during a period of genuine technological transition. But their cumulative effect has been to quietly reduce how much authority the people who actually love cars still hold inside the companies that build them. It would be easy to dismiss all of this as one aging broadcaster's personal grievance, except Clarkson is far from the only person saying versions of the same thing. His own longtime colleague James May, discussing the state of automotive television in a separate interview, said plainly that the entire format needs, in his words, a rethink. That the subject of cars has not been this genuinely interesting to cover in years, precisely because so much of what made it interesting has been engineered out of the newest models. The public reaction to the heated seat subscription tells a similar story from the other direction. The criticism online was not limited to hardcore enthusiasts, but came from ordinary owners united by a specific, easily understood grievance. Is a complaint really just nostalgia if it produces that broad and immediate reaction from people who are not car enthusiasts at all? A backlash that is unified, and that fast, is not typically what nostalgia produces. It also lines up with a broader consumer pushback that extends well beyond cars, visible in the right-to-repair movement gaining traction across electronics and appliances generally, where owners of everything from tractors to phones have started pushing back against manufacturers that design products to be serviced only through official, paid channels. Cars simply became the most expensive and most visible front in a fight that was already brewing everywhere else. So what does Clarkson actually do about all of this, beyond saying it out loud at a fan event? In an interview explaining his decision to end his decades-long television partnership with Hammond and May, he was characteristically blunt, telling one interviewer that after 36 years of talking about cars on television, he was packing it in, too old, and, in his own phrasing, too fat to get into the cars he genuinely liked, and no longer interested in driving the ones he did not. Their final special together, filmed in Zimbabwe, aired in September of 2024 and closed out 22 years of the three of them working together. That does not mean Clarkson has disappeared from the subject entirely. He continues expanding his farming and hospitality business, and the trio briefly reunited the following year for a shorter, more comedic project. Meanwhile, the show that made his reputation is reportedly being handed to a younger generation of presenters drawn from YouTube and social media, continuing under the same name with an entirely different set of voices behind it. He is not asking viewers to stop buying cars, and he is not lobbying a regulator. He is doing what he has always done, being loudly and specifically honest about what he personally observes from behind the wheel. What he observes at the end of a career spent loving cars more than almost anyone paid to write about them is an industry that quietly stopped building cars around the person driving them and started building cars around everything except that person instead. Whether that verdict outlives him as a talking point depends partly on whether the next generation of presenters inheriting his old platform experienced the golden window he keeps referencing, or whether they grew up entirely inside the era he is criticizing, with no earlier baseline to measure the newest cars against at all. Jeremy Clarkson's criticism isn't really about one car, one brand, or even one technology. It's about a question every driver should ask. When did cars stop being built for the people behind the wheel? Whether you agree with him or think he's simply nostalgic, his arguments have sparked a debate the entire industry can't ignore. As the next generation of cars continues to evolve, will manufacturers bring back the joy of driving or move even further away from it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.